for the job, be required for the job. So we're talking about simple screwdrivers available almost.
Analyzing the photos, I discovered that screw at the top was missing. The position of the dowel and the position of...
Ni siquiera después de morir la dejaron descansar.
On the evening of October 14th, 2025, Pamela did something she had been gathering the courage to do for months. She ended it. She finally said the words. She had no way of knowing that within hours, the man she had just left would use a key she never gave him to walk back through her front door, and that her screams would echo across an entire nation. Her full name was Pamela Genini. She was 29 years old. She was born on October 14th, 1996, which means the night she was murdered was, with devastating cruelty, her own birthday. She grew up in Strozza, a quiet, green village tucked into the Imagna Valley in the province of Bergamo, in northern Italy. It is the kind of place where everyone knows your name, where the mountains form a backdrop to childhood, and where the pace of life feels far removed from the noise of the city. So for a girl like Pamela, it was a beginning, not a destination. From the time she was very young, Pamela was drawn to beauty in its most expressive forms. She began her modeling career at age 8 with her first photo books and turned professional at 16 with her mother's support. That early start was not the story of a pushy parent and a reluctant child. It was the story of a girl who already knew what she wanted. She had an eye for composition, a comfort in front of the camera that most adults never develop, and a philosophy about her work that she would later articulate clearly in interviews. She shared her belief that photography should be simple, natural, and spontaneous, and that her cheerfulness should emerge in the work. That word, cheerfulness, appears again and again in how people who knew Pamela described her. It was not a performance. It was simply who she was. At 18, she made the decision that defines the arc of so many young Italian dreamers from smaller towns. She packed her bags and moved to Milan. She moved to Milan as an 18-year-old to pursue a career in fashion modeling. The city did not intimidate her. It energized her. Milan's fashion world is notoriously difficult to crack. It rewards persistence, personality, and an ability to reinvent yourself without losing your core. Pamela had all three. She began working her way through castings, shoots, and collaborations, building a presence in the industry, one connection at a time. Then, at 19, she made a bold and very public leap. She gained national attention when she appeared on the reality show L'isola di Adamo ed Eva, which aired on DJ TV. Her charm and confidence made her a favorite among viewers. The show placed contestants in a stripped-back, almost primal environment, and what it revealed about Pamela was something the fashion world had already sensed. She was completely comfortable in her own skin. She didn't perform confidence for the cameras. She simply had it. Viewers responded. After the show, she was no longer just a working model in Milan. She was a face people recognized, a personality people followed. But Pamela was never content to rest on a single identity. Following the show, Genini leveraged her visibility to pursue modeling full-time, collaborating with photographers who captured her natural solarity and spontaneity. And then she pushed further. She later co-founded a luxury swimwear brand called EP She-Lux with her friend Elisa Bartolotti, and also ran a successful real estate consulting business in Milan. EP She-Lux was not a vanity project. It was a made-in-Italy brand built from genuine passion. Two women who loved fashion, understood their audience, and believed in the product they were creating. The brand's website describes it as a venture built by a model and young entrepreneur who enjoys challenging herself by thinking outside the box. Alongside the swimwear brand, Genini excelled in luxury real estate, managing a branch in Milan's prestigious Via Montenapoleone and another in Santa Margherita Ligure. She handled high-end properties for affluent clients, including rentals in Italy's top coastal spots. For a woman not yet 30, this was a remarkable professional footprint. She was simultaneously a model, a brand co-founder, and a real estate entrepreneur, and she managed all three without the brittle performative hustle that burns so many young people out. Her friends described her energy as genuine. Her work was an extension of her joy, not a substitute for it. Her social media accounts showcased a glamorous lifestyle, featuring posts from Monte Carlo, Milan, Dubai, and vacation destinations including Venice, Paris, Portofino, the Dolomites, and Positano. To a casual observer, it looked like the curated fantasy of a successful influencer. But the people who knew Pamela understood that the travel, the photographs, the beautiful locations, these were not an act. She genuinely loved life in all its textures and colors. Yeah, she was the kind of person who made the people around her feel like the world was wider and more interesting than they had previously noticed. Pamela had a soft spot for animals, especially dogs. She was the proud owner of a Chihuahua named Bianca, who was more than just a pet. Bianca was family. Pamela often shared photos and videos of Bianca on her social media, showing their close bond. Whether it was a walk in the park or a cozy moment at home, Bianca was always by her side. In the months before her death, when Pamela had stopped sharing her location publicly for fear of being tracked, photographs of Bianca were among the few glimpses she still allowed the world into her private life. Even in fear, she held on to warmth. She was close to her mother, deeply close. It was in the months of escalating terror that would define the last chapter of her life. Her mother was one of the people she worried about most, not just for herself, but for what the man in her life had threatened to do to her family. In 2017, Pamela's father had met with a major accident, and since then, he has been in a vegetative state. That fact lands differently once you understand the full picture of Pamela's life. A young woman who had already learned to carry grief quietly, who had already watched her family navigate an unimaginable loss, and who had still found a way to build something beautiful out of her days. Her friends used words like bright, kind, and full of life. One friend shared online, "She had such an energy about her. It's impossible to believe she's gone. She was funny. She was stubborn in the way that ambitious people often are, not unkindly, but with a clear sense of direction." She had plans. She had a brand to grow, properties to sell, a dog to walk, a birthday to celebrate. She was 29 years old on the last night of her life, and the world in front of her was still wide open. But something had been quietly closing in on her for over a year. In March of 2024, Pamela had entered a relationship with a man more than 2 decades her senior. He presented himself as successful, worldly, established. He had money, connections, confidence. In the beginning, as these things so often do, it seemed like something promising. It would take months before the mask began to slip. And by the time it did, Pamela would find herself in a trap she didn't know how to escape. She had told her closest friends the truth. She had named her fear out loud. She had even written it down. She just didn't know it was already too late. There is a particular kind of danger that wears a suit. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with visible warning signs that strangers can read from across a room. It comes dressed in confidence, in resources, in the practiced ease of a man who has spent decades learning how to make people feel chosen. Gianluca Sonson was 52 years old when he killed Pamela Genini. And the most chilling thing about him was not his rage. It was how ordinary he appeared to everyone who did not know what was happening behind closed doors. Gianluca Sonson was born in Biella, a small industrial city in the Piedmont region of northwestern Italy, known historically for its textile manufacturing. He was a luxury entrepreneur who worked in the auto industry. By the time he entered Pamela's life, he moved through the world with the assured manner of a man who had built something, or at least presented himself as having done so. He drove expensive cars. He operated in the same circles as people with money and ambition. He knew how to project status, and in Italy's northern business culture, status opens doors and silences questions. But the foundation beneath that projection was far less solid than it appeared. According to the New York Post, Sonson was previously a person of interest in a financial scam involving the sale of luxury cars and evasion of taxes in 2010. At the time, Sonson was arrested in connection to the scam, which allegedly involved a cross-border connection between Germany and Italy. This was not a minor brush with the law. It was a deliberate, calculated scheme. The kind that requires sustained deception, the ability to appear trustworthy while systematically defrauding people, and a willingness to exploit systems for personal gain. Sonson, originally from Biella, had previously been arrested for a luxury car scam and had a criminal record for assault, fraud, and assault. 2 entries in a criminal file that, taken together, paint a portrait of a man who had already demonstrated both the willingness to deceive and the capacity for physical violence, years before he ever met Pamela Genini. What is documented about Sonson's deeper personal history is limited in English-language sources, but what emerges from Italian investigative reporting is telling. He was a man in his 50s pursuing a woman in her 20s. He presented himself to her social circle as a successful, generous, sophisticated partner. He had a property in Cervia, on Italy's Adriatic coast, a place he would later use as a site of control, pressuring Pamela to abandon her Milan life and move there to be with him. He reportedly tried to compel her to leave her job and move in with him in Cervia. This is a pattern that forensic psychologists who study coercive control recognize immediately. Isolate the target from her professional identity. Remove her from her support network. Make her entirely dependent on you. Sonson did not begin with a knife. He began with pressure. The relationship between Pamela and Sonson started in March 2024. From the beginning, he quickly demonstrated his violent and possessive nature. Punches and kicks, clothes torn off, a gun pointed at her stomach, constant abuse, and death threats against her and her parents. Read that again slowly. A gun pointed at her stomach. This was not a relationship that gradually deteriorated into violence. According to the accounts collected by prosecutors and witnesses, the violence arrived early and escalated without pause. Sonson did not lose control over time. He established control from the beginning, using fear as the primary mechanism. Repeated episodes of stalking and repeated attacks occurred, such as the one on the island of Elba when she was later rescued by some friends and taken to Sardinia. There were multiple incidents, multiple locations, multiple witnesses who saw or heard or knew. And yet, Pamela remained in the relationship. Not because she was passive, not because she failed to understand the danger, but because she understood it all too well. She knew what leaving might cost her. She had been told explicitly. The young woman, even though she wanted to distance herself and end the relationship, was afraid to break it off abruptly because she was afraid that Sonsen would harm her and her parents, telling her, "If you leave me, I will kill you and your mother." That threat, specific, personal, targeting the people she loved most, is a classic feature of what researchers call intimate terrorism. It is designed to make escape feel more dangerous than staying. And for Pamela, with a mother she adored and a father already lost to a vegetative state since 2017, the threat to her family carried a particular weight. Sonsen knew what mattered most to her. He used it as a leash. In her last period, when she went out, she never posted on social media about where she was going, for fear of being found and followed by the 52-year-old. This detail is quietly devastating. Here was a young woman who had built a public presence, a model, an influencer, a brand founder whose personality was her platform, now editing herself out of her own digital life to avoid being tracked by the man who claimed to love her. Her Instagram, once filled with sunlit photographs from Portofino and the Dolomites, went quiet on location. She was living in a kind of internal exile, present in the world, but hiding her coordinates. In the weeks leading up to October 14th, 2025, the situation accelerated toward crisis. Pamela had been confiding in Francesco, a former boyfriend with whom she had remained close friends, about the full extent of what Sonsen had been doing. She had told Francesco that she felt lonely, but was nevertheless happy to have found the courage to end the relationship. She was readying herself, gathering her nerve, telling the people closest to her that she was finally going to do it. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Sonsen had already made a move she hadn't detected. Sometime in the weeks prior, he had obtained a duplicate key to her apartment. The man, who had already stalked her in the previous months, had entered the house with a copy of the keys made without her knowledge. He had been inside her home before. He had prepared. While Pamela was summoning the courage to leave, and Sonsen was quietly ensuring that leaving would not protect her. Investigators later seized a dozen knives, both box cutters and switchblades similar to the one used to kill Pamela, and 4 or 5 blank pistols from his home in Serbia. This was not a crime of sudden passion. This was the home of a man who had surrounded himself with instruments of harm. The arsenal found in Serbia, the duplicate key made in secret, the months of escalating threats. These are not the details of an impulsive act. They are the details of premeditation, of a man who had decided, long before October 14th, that if Pamela left him, she would not survive the choice. The charge of premeditation filed by Milan prosecutor Alessia Menegazzo was not prosecutorial overreach. It was the logical conclusion of a documented pattern. On the afternoon of October 14th, 2025, Pamela's 29th birthday, she sat down with Sonsen and ended the relationship. Definitively. Finally. She said the words she had been afraid to say for months, and for a moment, it must have felt like breathing again. Like the first clean breath after a very long time underground. Sonsen left the apartment, but he still had the key. And somewhere in the hours that followed, the man who had threatened her life, who had pointed a gun at her stomach, who had stockpiled knives at his property on the Adriatic coast, made his decision. He was not done. October 14th, 2025, began the way birthdays sometimes do when you're 29 and building a life, quietly, with private significance. Pamela Genini woke up that morning in her apartment on Via Iglesias in Milan's Gorla neighborhood, like a working-class district in the northeastern part of the city, where tree-lined streets run between modest apartment buildings and local shops. It was her birthday. She was, by every account, in a fragile but determined state of mind. She had made a decision. Today was the day she was finally going to say it out loud and make it real. She had been preparing herself emotionally for weeks. She had talked to Francesco, her former boyfriend, now one of her closest friends, about her fear, her plans, and her exhaustion. She had told him she was going to end it. She had told him she was scared. And she had told him something else, something that revealed just how clearly she understood the man she was dealing with. She said she was afraid that if she left, Sonson would kill her. She had confided, "I can't leave him. Wait, otherwise, he'll kill me." And yet, on the morning of her 29th birthday, she had found the courage that fear had stolen from her for over a year. That afternoon, the conversation happened. That afternoon, she had permanently ended her relationship with Gianluca Sonsin, 23 years her senior. The details of that conversation, its exact words, its emotional temperature, whether Sonsin appeared to accept it or exploded immediately, are not fully documented in available records. What is known is that he left the apartment afterward. Neighbors in the building later told investigators they had heard arguing earlier that day. They had heard a woman's voice and a man's voice, the familiar rhythm of a confrontation that had clearly happened before in those walls. After Sonsin left, Pamela called Francesco. Now she told him that she felt lonely, but was nevertheless happy to have found the courage to end the relationship. That sentence, lonely but happy, is one of the most heartbreaking details in this entire case. She was sitting alone in her apartment on her birthday, her little Chihuahua Bianca nearby, and she was processing the enormous emotional weight of having finally done the thing she had been too afraid to do for months. She was not celebrating, but she was relieved. For a few hours on the evening of October 14th, 2025, Pamela Genini felt something that resembled freedom. Sonson had a key she didn't know about. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, the man, who had already stalked her in the previous months, entered the house with a copy of the keys made without her knowledge. Pamela was on the phone with Francesco when it happened. She was on the phone with her ex-boyfriend, a boy her age with whom she had maintained a great friendship, when Sonson entered the house. "Help, help, help," were her last words before ending the conversation. 3 words, spoken into a phone to someone who was not there. Then the line went dead. What happened in the minutes that followed was witnessed, in fragments, by neighbors in the surrounding apartments and in the building across the way. Neighbors in the Gorla neighborhood reported hearing Genini screaming for help around 10 p.m. that evening. Some witnesses attempted to break into the apartment to rescue her, while others called the police. A neighbor on a nearby balcony witnessed portions of the attack from an adjacent building and shouted to arriving officers to alert them to the emergency unfolding inside the apartment. Francesco, having heard Pamela's desperate words and the sudden end of the call, immediately contacted the police. The police was alerted to the incident by Genini's former boyfriend, who she had earlier confided in about her fear that her partner, Gianluca Sonsin, might end up taking her life. At 9:46 p.m., even as the attack was unfolding, Pamela somehow managed to send a text message, one of the most chilling final communications in the documented history of Italian femicide cases. She wrote, "I'm scared. This guy's completely crazy. I don't know what to do." And 6 minutes later, the last desperate message she sent before being killed. "Teso, what do I do?" She was texting for help while being attacked. She was trying to survive in every way available to her. Her voice, her phone, her words, right up until the very end. When officers arrived at the building and rang the intercom, what happened next revealed the terrifying clarity of Pamela's mind even in those final moments. When police arrived and rang the intercom, Genini answered, saying, "It's Glovo," in an apparent attempt to pretend it was a food delivery service. She was telling Sonson the police were not there. She was trying to buy herself seconds. It was an act of extraordinary presence of mind from a woman fighting for her life. Officers, understanding the situation, moved to enter the building. They heard her screaming, and when they managed to open the door, she was on the floor, breathing increasingly laboriously. Neighbors had heard her voice from the balcony, screaming words that would later be recounted in witness testimony to prosecutors. Among them were the words, "I won't do it again," "I love you," "Stop," "I have a family." The desperate bargaining language of someone trying to reason with the unreasonable, trying to find any combination of words that might make him stop. None of them worked. Milan prosecutor Alessia Menegazzo confirmed that Genini had been stabbed 24 times, sustaining injuries to her neck, back, chest, arms, and hands. The wounds to her hands and arms are what forensic specialists call defensive injuries. Evidence that she fought back, that she raised her arms to protect herself, that she did not stop resisting. Pamela Genini fought for her life until her body could no longer fight. By the time officers and firefighters broke down the apartment door, Genini had already sustained fatal injuries. She died at the scene before medical help could reach her. Upon seeing authorities enter the apartment, Sonson allegedly turned the knife on himself and slashed his own throat twice in an apparent suicide attempt. Sonson was transported to Milan's Niguarda Hospital, where he was stabilized and treated for non-life-threatening injuries. The injuries were superficial. His survival was never seriously in doubt. The news broke across Italy within hours. By the following morning, Pamela Genini's name and face were on the front pages of newspapers from Milan to Palermo. A candlelight march was held in Milan's Gorla district to honor Genini's memory. People who had never met her walked through the streets of her neighborhood holding flames. Pamela is the 17th victim of femicide in Italy in 2025. 17, before the year was even finished. And that number landed on the Italian public with the force of an indictment, not of one man, but of a system, a culture, a pattern of violence against women that had claimed another life on a Tuesday night in Milan. Social media filled with photographs of Pamela, her luminous smile on a beach somewhere in the Mediterranean, her face at the Venice Film Festival, a photograph with Bianca tucked under her arm. Friends and colleagues flooded social media with tributes, describing Genini as bright, kind, and full of life. Italy was grieving, and Italy was angry. Prosecutor Alessia Menegazzo and Deputy Prosecutor Letizia Manella had already begun building their case. The witnesses were many. The evidence was substantial, and the man responsible was lying in a hospital bed in Milan, alive, with a bandage on his neck, exercising, said from the very first moment of his arrest, his right to remain silent. The investigation that would follow would reveal not just what happened on the night of October 14th, but everything that had been allowed to happen in the 18 months before it. The investigation into the murder of Pamela Genini did not begin with mystery. The killer was known. He was in a hospital bed 2 miles from the crime scene with self-inflicted wounds on his throat and Pamela's blood on his hands. The police did not need to hunt Gianluca Sonsin. He was already caught. What the investigation needed to do, what Prosecutor Alessia Menegazzo and Deputy Prosecutor Letizia Manella set out to do in the hours and days following October 14, 2025, was something equally important and far more difficult. They needed to build a case that told the complete truth. Now, not just the truth of one night, but the truth of 18 months. Because in Italy, as in many countries, the difference between a conviction for simple homicide and a conviction for aggravated murder, murder compounded by premeditation, cruelty, stalking, and the specific designation of femicide, is not just a matter of legal classification. It is a matter of justice. It determines sentencing. It determines what the court formally acknowledges happened. And it determines what message the verdict sends to every other woman in Italy living in fear of a man who has told her that leaving will cost her her life. Menegazzo moved immediately. Immediately after the femicide, she heard several witnesses, not only some neighbors who heard a female voice calling for help and shouting, "I won't do it again! I love you! Stop! I have a family!" Or saw the young woman screaming, kneeling on the balcony while Sonsin slapped her, but also those who knew her well and had collected her confidences. The witnesses were crucial. They were numerous, and their testimonies, taken together, painted a portrait of sustained, escalating violence that had been hiding in plain sight for over a year. Francesco, Pamela's former boyfriend and closest confidant in her final months, became one of the most important witnesses in the case. His account allowed the reconstruction of the relationship between the victim and her killer, and the last moments of the 29-year-old's life, from which an appalling picture emerged, as described in the arrest warrant, amid of a crescendo of harassment and violence. He told investigators everything Pamela had shared with him: the threats against her mother, the duplicate key, the escalating physical violence, her terror in the weeks before her death, and her final decision to end the relationship on the afternoon of October 14th. He had been on the phone with her when Sonsin walked through her door. He had heard her last words. The arrest warrant that prosecutors prepared in the aftermath was dense with documented horror. The relationship began in March 2024, and Sonsin quickly demonstrated his violent and possessive nature: punches and kicks, clothes ripped off, a gun pointed at her stomach, constant abuse, and death threats against her and her parents. Each incident, as reconstructed by witness testimony, I added another layer to the formal charge of premeditation. This was not a man who snapped. This was a man who had been practicing violence on Pamela Genini for the entirety of their relationship, who had obtained a duplicate key to her apartment in secret, and who had returned to her home on the evening she finally broke free, armed, prepared, and deliberate. Investigators seized a dozen knives, both box cutters and switchblades similar to the one used to kill Pamela, and 4 or 5 blank pistols from his home in Servia. The search of Sonsin's Servia property was one of the key evidentiary developments in the days following the murder. The arsenal recovered there was significant, not because blank pistols are lethal, but because of what they revealed about the psychological landscape of the man who owned them. He had surrounded himself with weapons. He had lived with them. In the context of the threats he had made to Pamela, including pointing what she believed to be a gun at her stomach, The weapons cache transformed a pattern of abuse into something that looked, forensically and legally, like preparation. Meanwhile, in the hospital and then in his cell at San Vittore prison, Sonsen said nothing. Sonsen, assisted by lawyer Simona Luceri, chose to remain silent, as he had done immediately after his arrest in hospital, where he had been taken after staging a suicide attempt. The man, with a prominent bandage on his neck due to the superficial cuts he sustained immediately after the crime, was placed in solitary confinement in San Vittore prison. His lawyer offered the court an explanation for his silence. "He's not lucid. I found him in a state of shock, and he still hasn't fully grasped what happened." Italy did not find that explanation satisfying. Neither, it appears, did the investigating judge. The testimonies continued to accumulate. People who had seen Pamela in the months before her death, who had noticed her withdrawal from social media, who had watched her stop tagging her location in posts, who had heard her speak about her fear, all of them came forward. The picture that emerged from the Milan public prosecutor's office was of a woman who had been living in a state of sustained, documented terror, who had reached out to people around her for help, and who had ultimately found the courage to take the step that she believed, correctly, might get her killed. Several acts of violence were attributed to Gianluca Sonsen, including the incident on the island of Elba when Pamela was later rescued by some friends and taken to Sardinia. This incident, in which Pamela had to be physically rescued from Sonsen by friends and evacuated to another region of Italy, was among the incidents that investigators documented as part of the stalking and abuse pattern. It was not an isolated moment. It was part of a sequence. Sonsen was formally charged with murder, aggravated by multiple factors. He is held at the San Vittore prison and faces multiple felonies, such as murder aggravated by premeditation, frivolous motives, a romantic relationship, cruelty, and stalking the charge of femicide. Under Italian law, a specific aggravating designation for the murder of a woman motivated by gender-based violence was included. The inclusion of femicide as an aggravating charge was significant. It was a legal acknowledgement that what happened to Pamela was not simply the act of one disturbed individual. It was an act of gendered violence with a documented history of control, intimidation, and the systematic destruction of a woman's autonomy and safety. As of the time of this documentary's research, the trial of Gianluca Sonsen is ongoing. Italy's judicial process moves at a pace that often frustrates those seeking swift resolution. Full trial proceedings, given the complexity of the charges and the volume of evidence and witness testimony involved, are expected to continue. Sonsen remains in custody at San Vittore prison. He has continued to exercise his right to silence in multiple proceedings before the investigating judge. What is not in dispute, what the evidence, the witnesses, the text messages, the forensic analysis, and the documented history of violence make unambiguously clear, is what happened on the night of October 14, 2025, and in the 18 months that preceded it. A man with a history of violence, fraud, and control entered a woman's home using a key he had secretly copied, and he killed her 24 times over. He killed her on her birthday. He killed her on the same day she had finally found the courage to leave him. Pamela's mother, who has spoken to Italian media multiple times since her daughter's death, has been a devastated but persistent voice in the public conversation about what this case means. She has demanded answers. She has demanded justice. And in the months following October 14th, she would be dealt a blow so shocking, so grotesque, that it would return Pamela's name to the front pages of Italian newspapers in a way that nobody, not her family, not the investigators, not the nation that had already mourned her, could possibly have anticipated. Because the story of Pamela Genini did not end with her murder. It did not end with Sonsen in a prison cell or with Italy lighting candles in the streets of Gorla. It did not end with the charges filed or the witnesses heard or the knives catalogued in an evidence room in Milan, 5 months after Pamela was laid to rest in the quiet cemetery of Strazza, the same village in the Amagna Valley where she had grown up, where the mountains frame the skyline and the pace of life is slow and gentle. Workers arrived to transfer her coffin to the family chapel, and they found something that silenced an entire country. Pamela Genini was laid to rest on October 24, 2025. 10 days after her murder. 10 days after Italy had watched the news in disbelief, after the candlelight marches had filled the streets of Gorla, after her photograph, that radiant, open face, had appeared on the front pages of newspapers from Milan to Rome. She was buried at the Strazza Cemetery in the northern Italian province of Bergamo, the village where she had been born, where she had grown up in the shadow of the Imagna Valley Mountains, where the people who had known her longest could visit her. It was supposed to be the beginning of the long, painful process of grieving, of trying somehow to find peace. It was not the end of her story. The harrowing sequence of events began on March 23, 2026, when cemetery staff at Strazza were preparing to move Genini's coffin from a temporary burial niche to the family chapel. Workers noticed that the screws on the coffin had been loosened and it could not be properly closed. When officials opened the casket in the presence of law enforcement and a prosecutor, they were confronted with a shocking scene. The body of the 29-year-old model and entrepreneur had been mutilated, her head severed. The news broke across Italy with the force of a second catastrophe. A country that had already mourned Pamela Genini, that had already processed, incompletely, imperfectly, but genuinely, the horror of what had been done to her, was now confronted with something that had no adequate language. Her mother, Una Smirnova, spoke to Italian media in the immediate aftermath, where she described living through a continuous nightmare and said she did not know how to move forward without being able to bury her daughter. In another interview, she found words that carried both grief and grace. May God forgive them for their ignorance. My only hope is that something will emerge, that someone will speak up or see something. I hope that the person who committed this terrible act will repent, even if I don't know if he or she will. A mother, asking God for forgiveness on behalf of the people who violated her murdered daughter's grave. The dignity in that statement is almost unbearable to sit with. The desecration was classified by the Bergamo Public Prosecutor's Office as corpse desecration and theft of body parts, offenses that, under Article 411 of the Italian Penal Code, all carry prison sentences of 2 to 7 years, with penalties even more severe for crimes committed in a cemetery. The investigation was handled by the Carabinieri of the Zogno Company and the Bergamo Provincial Command, but as of the time of this documentary's research, no arrests have been made and the motive remains unclear. Investigators are examining biological traces, DNA, pollen, and metallic residues on the coffin to reconstruct what happened after her death. The analyses are led by Cristina Cataneo, forensic pathologist and director of Labanov in Milan, a laboratory specializing in anthropology, medicine, and forensic sciences, already known for the Garlasco case. The science is meticulous. The investigators are serious. But Pamela's head has not been found, and her mother cannot close the family chapel door over a complete body. But Francesco Dolci, another former partner of Pamela Genini, publicly alleged on Rai 2's Or 14 that the desecration was part of a criminal conspiracy aimed at intimidating him. "They want to silence me because I know too many things," Dolci claimed. He stated that he had already provided investigators with significant information, but insisted there was still more to reveal to ensure justice for Pamela. He described ongoing threats, forced entry into his home, multiple aggressions, and the need to change his residence, framing the grave desecration as part of a broader criminal design. Whether Dolci's claims represent the truth of a widening conspiracy, the testimony of a traumatized man seeking meaning in chaos, or something in between, is something only the ongoing investigation will determine. What is certain is that the case of Pamela Genini has refused, at every turn, to become simple. Meanwhile, the murder trial was ongoing when the grave desecration emerged, further complicating the investigation. Europeans 24 Gianluca Sonsen remains in custody at San Vittore prison in Milan. He has maintained his silence across multiple proceedings. He has not expressed remorse publicly. He has not explained himself. The man who told Pamela that leaving him would cost her life, who secretly copied her key, who returned to her apartment on her birthday and stabbed her 24 times. That man sits in a cell, declining to speak, while two separate investigative offices pursue two separate crimes connected to the same woman's name. The impact of Pamela's case on Italy's national conversation about femicide and domestic violence has been profound and ongoing. Pamela was the 17th victim of femicide in Italy in 2025, a statistic that, when announced in the days after her murder, produced a reckoning. Italy has laws addressing stalking and gender-based violence. It has the designation of femicide as a specific aggravating charge under its penal code. And yet, despite those laws, despite the documented history of violence that Sonsen had committed against Pamela over 18 months, despite the text messages and the witnesses and the incidents on Elba and the flight to Sardinia, she was still killed, on her birthday, in her own home, by a man using a key she never gave him, where her case has been cited repeatedly in Italian parliamentary debates and advocacy campaigns pushing for stronger, faster intervention protocols for women who report stalking and intimate partner violence. The question that her case forces into the open is not a comfortable one. What would it have taken for the system to protect her? She had confided in friends. She had been rescued by friends after an attack. She had told the people close to her she feared for her life. At what point does a woman's documented fear become sufficient grounds for the state to act? Before, not after, the man who threatened her decides to follow through. There are no clean answers, but Pamela's name now belongs permanently to that conversation in Italy and beyond it, where her business partner and close friend Elisa Bartolottis has continued to honor Pamela's memory publicly, keeping the story of EP She Lux, their shared creation, alive. Her dog, Bianca, the little Chihuahua who appeared in so many of Pamela's photographs, was cared for by her family after her death. In Strozza, the village that raised her, people who watched her grow from a small girl with photo books into a young woman with a brand and a career and a life full of light, those people carry her with them. And her mother, Una Smirnova, carries the most weight of all. A woman who lost her husband to a vegetative state in 2017, who watched her daughter build something extraordinary from grief and ambition, who then lost that daughter to violence on the evening of October 14th, 2025, and who then, 5 months later, I was told that even the grave had not kept Pamela safe. What this case reveals about society is not a mystery. It reveals that the infrastructure around intimate partner violence, the laws, the intervention systems, the social understanding of coercive control, is still not fast enough, not responsive enough, not serious enough to protect women who have already named their fear. Pamela named hers. She named it in text messages, in conversations with friends, in the documented history of a relationship that left bruises and scars and a gun pointed at her stomach. She was not silent. She was not passive. She was a young woman trying to survive a trap that closed a little tighter every time she reached for the exit. She deserved better. She deserved faster. She deserved a door that locked against the man who had copied her key. She deserved more time. Her name was Pamela Genini. She was born in a mountain village in Bergamo, and she carried its quiet dignity into the loudest rooms of Milan. She built a career out of joy and a brand out of friendship. She loved a small dog named Bianca and the sea and the sunlight on the Dolomites. She was funny and stubborn and brave in ways she never got full credit for, because the bravest thing she ever did, leaving a man who had promised to kill her, was the last thing she ever did. She was 29 years old, and the world was still wide open in front of her. She deserved every year she didn't get. The world is less bright, less warm, and less just without her in it.